The thermometer read negative 58 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of January 14, 1868, and inside every log cabin in the settlement, families shivered violently as frost crept across interior walls. Inside the hay bale dome that Anders Bergman had built while his neighbors laughed, 12 people sat in shirt sleeves drinking hot coffee, while lamplight disappeared in cabin after cabin as the cold claimed those who had mocked his foolishness. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable. The Dakota Territory in 1867 was not a place for the weak or the unprepared. The land stretched flat and merciless in every direction, broken only by occasional creek beds and the low rolling hills that provided scant protection from winds that swept down from Canada with nothing to slow them. Winter in this country was a test of endurance that killed the careless and humbled the confident. Men who had survived winters in Minnesota or Wisconsin found the Dakota cold to be something altogether different, something that penetrated deeper and lasted longer than anything they had known. The settlement at Yankton Bend was typical of frontier communities in the territory during this period. 43 families had established claims along a curve in the James River where the land was fertile enough for wheat and the water was reliable year-round. Most families had arrived in the spring of 1865, drawn by the Homestead Act's promise of free land to anyone willing to work it. They had built their cabins using techniques brought from previous homes in the East, constructing sturdy log structures that had served their grandfathers well in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and would presumably serve them equally well in Dakota. The settlement's economy was simple and brutal. Wheat was the primary cash crop, sold to grain buyers who came upriver from Sioux City twice each year. Between harvests, families survived on what they could grow, hunt, or trade, with the few merchants who operated in Yankton proper, a larger town 15 miles to the south. Credit was extended carefully. Cash was scarce. Survival depended on planning, hard work, and the ability to endure hardship without complaint. Winter was the annual trial that sorted the competent from the doomed. A successful family would enter winter with a full root cellar, several cords of split firewood, preserved meat, enough grain to last until spring planting, and a cabin chinked well enough to keep out the worst of the wind. An unsuccessful family would run out of food by February, burn furniture when the firewood ran low, and pray that an early thaw would save them. Most years, some families didn't make it through. Children died of pneumonia. Adults succumbed to accidents or exposure. The cemetery on the hill above the settlement added new graves every spring, markers for those who had underestimated what the land demanded. The winter of 1866 to 1867 was shaping up to be a difficult one, but not catastrophic. The harvest had been adequate. Families had prepared with their usual thoroughness. As autumn turned to winter and the first snows fell in November, the settlement seemed positioned to survive another season. No one anticipated what was coming in January. No one imagined that the techniques their fathers had taught them, the cabin-building methods that had worked for generations, were about to fail in the most devastating way possible. Anders Bergman had arrived at Yankton Bend in the spring of 1861, making him one of the earliest settlers in the region. He had come from Norway at age 19, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a carpenter's skill set learned from his father in the valleys north of Bergen. Unlike many immigrants who arrived in groups from the same village, Anders had come alone. His family had died during a harsh winter when he was 17, and he had spent 2 years working in Liverpool to earn passage to America. He was not a large man, standing just under 6 feet tall, with the wiry build of someone who worked constantly but never had quite enough to eat. His face was weathered beyond his 32 years, lined from squinting into Dakota winds, and marked by the kind of permanent sunburn that came from farming without a hat. He spoke English with a thick accent that some settlers found difficult to understand, so he had learned early to communicate more through action than words. People respected him because he was competent, not because he was charming. Anders had claimed 160 acres along a slight elevation that gave him good drainage and a clear view of approaching weather. His first cabin had been crude, built in a hurry before winter arrived in 1861. He had survived that winter and spent the following spring building a proper structure using logs he had cut and hauled himself. The cabin was small, just 16 feet by 20 feet, but it was built well. The corners were tight. The roof didn't leak. The door hung straight. It was the kind of structure that other settlers pointed to as an example of good craftsmanship. In 1863, Anders had traveled to Yankton proper and married a woman named Ingrid Halvorsen, the daughter of another Norwegian immigrant family. She was 18, quiet like Anders, and capable in the way that frontier wives needed to be. She could cook, sew, preserve food, tend a garden, and manage a household with almost no resources. They had worked their claim together for 3 years, slowly improving their situation. By 1866, they had expanded their cabin, added a small barn for their 2 oxen and 3 cows, and cleared enough land to plant 20 acres of wheat. In November of 1866, Ingrid gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Karin after Anders' mother. The baby was healthy, and Ingrid recovered well from the birth. Anders had felt for the first time since leaving Norway that he was building something permanent. He had land, a family, and a future. The settlement's other Norwegian families had welcomed the baby with gifts of food and hand-sewn baby clothes. Life was hard, but it was good in the way that frontier life could be good when a man had something to work for. Winter arrived early that year. The first significant snow fell on December 2nd, and the temperature dropped steadily through the month. By Christmas, the settlement was locked in cold that felt deeper than previous years, but nothing extraordinary. Families stayed indoors, burned their firewood steadily, and waited for spring. January 12, 1867, began as an unremarkable winter day. The temperature was cold, but manageable, perhaps 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Anders spent the morning doing barn chores, feeding his livestock and checking that their water hadn't frozen solid. Ingrid stayed inside with Karin, who at 2 months old was beginning to smile and make small sounds that delighted her mother. The cabin was warm from the fireplace Anders had stoked before going outside. By mid-afternoon, the wind began to change. Anders noticed it first as a shift in direction, coming now from the northwest instead of the west. The temperature started dropping noticeably. He brought extra firewood inside, stacking it near the fireplace so they wouldn't have to go out after dark. He checked the chinking between the logs, finding a few spots where the mud and moss mixture had cracked. He repaired them quickly with materials he kept for this purpose. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted with terrifying speed. By the time Anders finished evening barn chores, his breath was freezing into ice crystals that fell tinkling to the ground. The cold burned his lungs. His fingers went numb inside his gloves within minutes of exposure. He hurried back to the cabin and barred the door behind him, grateful for the warmth inside. Ingrid had prepared a simple supper of bean soup and cornbread. They ate quietly, as was their custom, while Karin slept in the wooden cradle Anders had built. After supper, Anders added more wood to the fire, and they prepared for bed. The cabin's single room was divided by a curtain. Their bed was on one side, Karin's cradle on the other, near the fireplace where the warmth was greatest. Around midnight, Anders woke to cold. Not the mild chill that came from a fire burning low, but genuine, penetrating cold. He could see his breath inside the cabin. The fire was still burning, but the heat seemed to be sucked away before it could warm the room. He got up and added more wood, building the fire higher than usual. The flames roared, but the cold remained. Frost was forming on the interior walls. He could hear the wind outside, a steady howl that, sounded like something alive and furious. Ingrid woke and immediately checked on Karin. The baby was crying weakly. Ingrid picked her up and brought her into their bed, wrapping blankets around all three of them. Anders kept the fire blazing, burning wood faster than he had ever burned it. Nothing helped. The cold crept through the walls, through the floor, through every gap and crack, despite his careful chinking. They huddled together under every blanket they owned. Karin's crying grew weaker. Ingrid held her daughter against her chest, trying to share her body heat. Anders wrapped himself around both of them, desperately trying to create warmth with his own body. The fire roared, the wind howled, the cold won. Karin died sometime in the hours before dawn. Ingrid felt the small body go still and cold in her arms. She didn't cry out. She simply held her daughter and stared at nothing while Anders kept feeding the fire. When morning light finally came through the small window, the interior of the cabin was still below freezing despite the fire that had burned all night. Anders looked at his wife holding their dead child and felt something break inside himself that would never properly heal. Ingrid followed her daughter within 2 days. The cold had damaged her lungs during that terrible night, and pneumonia set in with brutal speed. She developed a fever, struggled to breathe, and died on January 15th while Anders sat helpless beside her. He had kept the fire burning constantly, had wrapped her in every warm thing he owned, had done everything he knew how to do. None of it mattered. The cabin that he had built with such care, the structure that other settlers admired, had become a death trap when the temperature dropped far enough. The ground was frozen too hard to dig graves. Anders and 3 other men from the settlement spent an entire day breaking through frozen earth with picks and iron bars to create a single grave large enough for Ingrid and Karin. They buried mother and daughter together on January 16th on the hill above the settlement, where 6 other fresh graves marked families who had died during the same cold snap. 9 people had frozen to death in 48 hours in cabins that were supposed to protect them. After the funeral, Anders returned to his cabin and sat staring at the fireplace. The fire was burning. The cabin was warm again now that the temperature outside had risen to merely cold instead of catastrophically cold. He looked at the walls he had built, the roof he had carefully constructed, the door that fit so precisely in its frame. He had done everything right by the standards he knew. He had followed the techniques his father had taught him, the methods that had worked in Norway, the same construction approach every family in the settlement used. And his family had died anyway. That night, Anders walked to his barn to check on his livestock. The animals were fine. The cows were chewing their cud, peacefully. The oxen were calm. The barn was cold, but the animals showed no signs of distress. Anders stood in the barn for a long time, noticing something he had never paid attention to before. The barn was built more crudely than his cabin. The gaps between the logs were larger. There was no fireplace, no source of heat at all. Yet somehow the animals had survived a cold snap that had killed 9 people in well-built cabins with fires burning all night. He looked at the loose hay piled in the corners and scattered on the floor. He looked at the way the cows had bedded down in the deepest hay. He reached down and pushed his hand into a pile of loose hay. Warmth. Not much, but definitely warmer than the surrounding air. Something in Anders' mind shifted. A question formed that would consume him for the next 8 months. Anders began spending his evenings in the barn. He would finish his daily work, eat a cold supper alone in the cabin he could no longer bear to occupy for long, and then retreat to the barn where his grief was less suffocating. The other settlers thought he was losing his mind. A man sleeping in his barn instead of his house was a sign of broken reason. But Anders wasn't sleeping in the barn. He was studying it. He brought a thermometer with him, one of 2 he owned for tracking weather. He placed it in different locations throughout the barn, measuring temperature variations. On the floor in open air, the temperature matched the outside cold, but when he buried the thermometer in loose hay, the reading was consistently 10 to 15 degrees warmer. When he placed it near the cows bedded in deep hay, the temperature was 20 degrees warmer than outside. The animals themselves generated heat, Anders knew that, but the heat they produced would dissipate immediately in the cold air unless something held it. The hay was holding it. He pulled apart the dried grass stems, examining their structure. Each stem was hollow, filled with air. Thousands of hollow stems created thousands of tiny air pockets. Air didn't conduct heat well. The trapped air in the hay was acting as a barrier, preventing the animals' warmth from escaping, while preventing outside cold from penetrating. Anders started experimenting. He built a small box from scrap lumber, filled it with tightly packed hay, and placed his thermometer inside. He left it overnight in the barn. In the morning, the thermometer inside the hay-filled box read 12 degrees warmer than an identical thermometer sitting in open air. He had created warmth with no fire, no active heat source, just dead grass-trapping air. He expanded the experiment. He built a larger box, big enough to sit inside, and packed the walls with compressed hay a foot thick. He crawled inside with a candle and his thermometer. Within an hour, the interior temperature had risen 15 degrees above the barn's ambient temperature just from his body heat and the single candle. The hay walls were holding the warmth inside. The principle became clear. His cabin walls were solid logs. Wood conducted heat slowly, but it conducted heat. The cold outside was pulling warmth through the solid wood faster than his fireplace could replace it. The barn walls had gaps and poor construction, but those gaps were filled with hay. The hay, with its thousands of air pockets, was preventing heat transfer far more effectively than solid wood ever could. Anders sat in his experimental hay box and understood what he needed to build. Not a better log cabin. Something entirely different. Something that would trap warmth the way the hay trapped warmth around his livestock. Something his neighbors would think was absolute madness. Spring arrived late in 1867, and with it came the slow return of life to the settlement. Families emerged from their cabins thinner and harder than before. The winter had killed 9 people and broken something in the community's confidence. The survivors planted their crops with the grim determination of people who had learned that competence was not always enough. Anders planted his wheat alone, working his fields in silence while his cabin stood empty behind him. He spent his nights reading everything he could find about heat and cold. The settlement had no library, but the minister in Yankton proper had a small collection of books. Anders borrowed a physics text written for school children and a farmer's almanac that included a section on livestock shelter. He read slowly, translating from English to Norwegian in his mind, but he read thoroughly. He learned that air was one of nature's best insulators when trapped and still. He learned that materials with many small air spaces resisted heat transfer better than solid materials. He learned the word insulation. During the day, he worked his farm. During the evening, he experimented with hay. He learned that loose hay had good insulating properties but compressed too easily. Tightly packed hay in bales maintained its structure and its air pockets. He discovered that hay bales stacked with their cut ends, facing outward, created a wall that was both structural and insulating. He tested different thicknesses, measuring temperature differences across hay walls of varying depth. 2 feet of compressed hay bales provided extraordinary resistance to heat transfer. He began sketching designs. A structure built entirely from hay bales would be revolutionary, but it would also need to address practical problems. Hay was flammable, so any fireplace or stove would need careful isolation. Hay would absorb moisture, so the structure would need protection from rain and snow. Hay bales were rectangular, which made building curves difficult, but curves were important for shedding snow and distributing weight. Anders visited other settlements within riding distance, looking at how different immigrants built their structures. He saw sod houses built by Swedish settlers using blocks of earth cut from the prairie. The principle was similar to what he envisioned, stacking irregular blocks to create walls, but sod was heavy and cold. He saw a root cellar built with an arched roof that supported tremendous weight through its curved shape. The arch principle could work with hay bales if he stacked them correctly. By summer, Anders had a design. A dome-shaped structure built from hay bales stacked in a circular pattern, each layer slightly smaller than the one below, creating a self-supporting arch. The bales would provide walls 2 feet thick. A wooden door frame and a small chimney would be the only non-hay elements. The entire structure would be coated in clay plaster to protect against moisture and fire. It would look absurd. It would violate every principle of proper construction the settlement knew. And if his calculations were correct, it would stay warm inside with a fraction of the firewood a log cabin required. In July of 1867, Anders mentioned his plan to build a hay shelter at the settlement's monthly gathering. The reaction was immediate and unanimous. People laughed. Not polite chuckling, but open mocking laughter. The idea of building a house from hay bales was so absurd that even sympathetic neighbors who pitied Anders for his loss couldn't take it seriously. Hay was for feeding animals. Hay was flammable. Hay rotted when it got wet. Building a house from hay was the idea of a man whose grief had broken his mind. Thomas McCarran, an Irishman who had built a solid double cabin and considered himself an expert in frontier construction, was particularly vocal. He explained with exaggerated patience that hay had no structural strength, that the first strong wind would blow it apart, that mice and rats would infest it within weeks, and that a single spark would turn it into an inferno. He suggested that Anders would be better served by rebuilding his cabin properly and finding a new wife to fill it. Anders didn't argue. He had expected this reaction. He simply stated that he would build his hay structure by autumn and invited anyone interested to examine it when finished. The laughter followed him as he left the gathering. Over the following weeks, the story spread. Bergman's planning to build a house out of hay became a running joke in the settlement. Children made up songs about it. Men placing bets in the trading post wagered on how many days the structure would stand before collapsing. The mockery intensified when Anders began purchasing hay bales. The settlement's farmers sold surplus hay to raise cash, and Anders bought every bale he could afford. He paid fair prices, which made the sellers happy to take his money even while they questioned his sanity. He ordered specific bale sizes, rejecting any that were too loose or irregular. The farmers thought this was hilarious. Here was a man inspecting hay bales with the care most people reserved for selecting lumber, all to build a house that would obviously fail. Anders ignored the jokes and continued his preparations. He purchased clay from a deposit along the river. He collected wooden poles for the doorframe and interior bracing. He built a stone foundation ring on high ground near his cabin, creating a level circular base 18 feet in diameter. Neighbors who passed by his claim shook their heads at the waste of effort. The phrase Bergman's haystack entered common usage as a term for any foolish project doomed to failure. Anders selected his building site with the same methodical care he had applied to every aspect of his plan. He chose a spot 100 yards from his existing cabin on a slight rise that provided natural drainage. The location was higher than the surrounding land by perhaps 6 feet. Not dramatic elevation, but enough to keep groundwater away from his foundation during spring thaw. The rise also gave him clear sight lines in all directions, allowing him to see approaching weather or visitors from a distance. He began work in early August, starting with the foundation. Most structures in the settlement were built directly on the ground or on a few flat rocks to keep the lowest logs off the soil. Anders dug a circular trench 18 feet in diameter and 8 inches deep. His neighbors who passed by assumed he was digging a root cellar, which would at least make sense. When he began filling the trench with stones instead of using it for storage, the confusion turned to fresh mockery. Anders hauled river stones for 3 days, selecting flat pieces that would stack and interlock. He laid them carefully in the trench, building up a stone ring that extended 6 inches above ground level. The result was a circular foundation that was perfectly level, checked constantly with a wooden level he had borrowed from the settlement's carpenter. The stone ring would keep the hay bales off the ground, preventing moisture from wicking up from the soil into his walls. Inside the stone foundation, Anders laid a floor of packed earth mixed with clay. He wetted the mixture and tamped it down with a heavy wooden block, compacting it into a surface that was nearly as hard as stone. Over this he spread a layer of sand for drainage and then flat stones fitted together like a crude mosaic. The floor took him another 4 days to complete. By the time he finished, he had invested a week of labor on foundation and flooring, and he hadn't yet placed a single hay bale. The settlement's skeptics found this particularly amusing. Here was Bergman spending more time on the foundation for his hay house than most men spent building an entire cabin. The careful stonework, the level checking, the precise circular shape, all of it seemed like elaborate effort wasted on a fundamentally ridiculous concept. Thomas McCarran visited the site one afternoon and openly laughed at the careful foundation. He pointed out that hay weighed almost nothing, that Anders was building a foundation suitable for a stone building too. Support dried grass. Anders just nodded and continued working. The foundation served multiple purposes that Anders understood even if his critics didn't. The stone ring elevated the bales above ground moisture and provided a level base that would prevent settling. The stone floor inside would reflect heat from his fire back up into the living space and provide a surface that wouldn't absorb moisture. The circular shape was essential for the dome design he planned, distributing weight evenly around the perimeter. Everything was intentional. Everything served the physics of what he was building. But explaining physics to men who trusted tradition over theory seemed pointless, so Anders simply continued his work in silence. Anders began stacking hay bales in mid-August. He had purchased 140 bales, each approximately 18 inches wide, 24 inches long, and 14 inches high. The bales were tightly compressed wheat straw bound with twine, the standard format for hay storage in the region. He had inspected every bale before purchase, rejecting any that were loose, damp, or irregular in shape. The farmers who sold to him had been happy to let him be selective. His money spent the same, regardless of his strange requirements. The first course of bales went down on the stone foundation in a perfect circle. Anders had calculated that he needed 16 bales to form the base ring. He laid them with their long sides parallel to the circle's curve, creating a wall 2 feet thick. The bales didn't fit the curve perfectly since they were rectangular, but by leaving small gaps on the outer edge and tight joints on the inner edge, he created a reasonably circular wall. He filled the outer gaps with loose straw, packing it tightly. Each bale weighed approximately 60 pounds. Anders could lift and position them alone, but the work was physically demanding. He used wooden stakes driven into the ground inside and outside the circle to hold the first course in position while he worked. The stakes would be removed later, but they prevented the bales from shifting during construction. He checked his circle constantly, measuring diameter at multiple points to ensure uniformity. The second course went down offset from the first, like bricks in a wall. This created an interlocking pattern that added structural strength. Anders had learned this principle from examining brick buildings in Yankton. The offset meant that the joints between bales in one course didn't align with joints in the course below, preventing vertical weak lines that could fail under pressure. He positioned each bale carefully, ensuring tight contact with its neighbors. As he built upward, Anders began curving the wall inward to create his dome shape. This was the most challenging aspect of the construction. Each course had to be slightly smaller in diameter than the one below, creating a gradual curve that would eventually close at the top. He calculated that he needed to reduce the diameter by approximately 6 inches per course to achieve the dome profile he wanted. The math was simple, but the execution required precision. By the fourth course, the inward curve was becoming visible. The structure began to look like an igloo, built from rectangular blocks instead of ice. Neighbors who visited the site were confused by what they were seeing. It didn't look like any building they knew. The hay walls were already 2 feet thick and curving inward in a way that seemed unstable. Surely the whole thing would collapse inward once he removed the supporting stakes. Anders ignored the predictions and continued stacking. He incorporated wooden bracing as he built. Every third course, he laid long wooden poles across the diameter of the structure, embedding them in the hay bale walls. These poles served as tension rings, preventing the walls from spreading outward under the weight of upper courses. The poles were invisible from outside, hidden within the hay, but they were essential to the structural integrity of the dome. The dome shape Anders was creating served multiple engineering purposes that became clearer as the structure rose. A vertical wall built from hay bales would be inherently unstable, requiring extensive external bracing to prevent collapse. But a dome distributed weight through compression, with each bale pressing against its neighbors in a way that made the entire structure self-supporting. The principle was ancient, used in stone architecture for thousands of years, but applying it to hay bales was unprecedented in frontier construction. As the walls curved inward with each successive course, the structure began to demonstrate its own stability. Anders removed the temporary wooden stakes that had supported the lower courses, and the walls stood firm. The weight of the upper bales pressed down and inward, creating compression forces that locked everything together. Visitors who had predicted immediate collapse were puzzled to find the structure standing solidly without any visible support system. The inward curve also created aerodynamic properties that would matter in Dakota's fierce winds. A vertical wall caught wind directly, creating pressure that could push a poorly built structure over. The dome's curved surface deflected wind upward and around, reducing the force applied to the structure. Snow would slide off the curved surface rather than accumulating on top, preventing dangerous weight buildup during winter storms. Anders hadn't planned for these benefits initially, but he recognized them as his dome took shape. By the 8th course, the structure was 7 feet tall and the diameter had narrowed to 10 feet. The curve was pronounced enough that Anders had to work from inside, stacking bales while standing in the center of his shrinking circle. The interior space was becoming defined, a round room that felt surprisingly spacious despite the thick walls consuming much of the foundation's diameter. Light filtered through the gaps between bales, creating a warm, amber glow that reminded Anders of being inside a haystack as a child. The challenge of closing the dome at the top required careful planning. Anders needed to leave an opening for his chimney, which meant the dome couldn't close into a perfect point. He decided on a circular opening at the apex approximately 2 feet in diameter. To support the bales around this opening, he built a wooden ring from bent poles, lashed together. This ring sat atop the final course of bales, defining the chimney opening and providing a structure for the top bales to rest against. The final courses required him to cut bales to fit the increasingly tight curve. He used a hay knife, a long blade designed for cutting through compressed hay, to trim bales to the exact sizes needed. The cut bales created custom pieces that filled the gaps perfectly as the dome closed around the chimney opening. The work was meticulous and slow. Each piece had to be measured, cut, and fitted individually. When Anders placed the final bale around the chimney ring, the dome was complete. The structure stood 12 feet tall at its apex, a smooth curve of golden hay rising from the stone foundation. It looked like nothing else in the settlement, organic and strange, more like a giant beehive than a building. Anders stood back and examined his work. The doorway required careful engineering to avoid creating a massive weak point in the otherwise continuous dome structure. Anders had left a gap in the first 3 courses of hay bales on the south-facing side, creating an opening 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. This opening needed to be reinforced to prevent the hay bales above from collapsing inward, and it needed a door system that would maintain the structure's insulation properties while allowing access. Anders built a wooden frame from thick oak planks he had purchased in Yankton. The frame was constructed like a miniature building, with vertical posts extending from the stone foundation to a horizontal header beam that would support the weight of the hay bales above the opening. He mortised and pegged the joints, creating a rigid structure that could bear substantial weight. The frame fit precisely into the opening he had left, and he packed loose straw tightly between the wooden posts and the cut ends of the hay bales. The door itself was built in 2 layers. The outer door was solid wood, constructed from tongue and groove planks 3 inches thick. Anders shaped each plank carefully, fitting them so tightly that almost no light passed between them. He reinforced the assembled door with diagonal bracing on the interior side, creating an X pattern that prevented warping. Heavy iron hinges mounted to the wooden frame allowed the door to swing inward, and a thick wooden bar dropped into iron brackets provided a locking mechanism from inside. But the outer door was only the first barrier. Anders built a second door, 18 inches inside the first, creating an airlock chamber between them. This inner door was lighter, constructed from 2-inch planks, but it was built with the same careful joinery. The airlock chamber served a critical purpose. When someone entered or exited, they would open one door, step into the chamber, close that door, and then open the second door. This prevented outside air from flowing directly into the living space, maintaining the interior temperature even during entries and exits. The floor of the airlock chamber was recessed 6 inches below the main floor level. This created a cold trap where heavy cold air would settle rather than flowing into the main living area. Anders had read about this principle in his borrowed physics text. Cold air was denser than warm air and would naturally sink to the lowest available point. The recessed airlock floor gave that cold air a place to settle away from the living space. He sealed every gap around both door frames with his clay mixture, creating airtight seals. He built a small shelf in the airlock chamber for setting down items during entry, and he included wooden pegs for hanging coats. The entire door system was over-engineered by frontier standards, but it would prevent heat loss that plagued single-door cabins. Every time someone opened a standard cabin door, warm air rushed out and cold air flowed in. Anders' airlock system would eliminate that problem almost entirely, preserving the warmth his structure would generate and hold. The chimney presented Anders with his most difficult engineering challenge. He needed a way to vent smoke from his fire without creating a massive hole in his insulation or posing a fire hazard to the hay bale walls. The solution required combining materials and techniques in ways that were unconventional but necessary for his unique structure. Anders started with a stone firebox built in the center of the dome floor. He constructed it from river stones, mortared together with clay, creating a circular fire chamber 2 feet in diameter and 18 inches deep. The stones would absorb and radiate heat while protecting the hay floor from direct flame contact. Around this firebox, he built a larger stone apron extending 4 feet in all directions, creating a fireproof zone that separated the flames from any combustible material. The chimney itself was built from nested cylinders. The innermost cylinder was fired clay pipe sections he had purchased from a pottery works in Sioux City at considerable expense. These pipe sections were 8 inches in diameter and designed specifically for stove chimneys. They fit together with overlapping joints that prevented smoke leakage. The clay pipe would carry the hot smoke safely without transferring dangerous heat to surrounding materials. Around the clay pipe, Anders built a second cylinder from stones stacked without mortar. This stone cylinder was 16 inches in diameter, creating a 4-inch gap between the hot clay pipe and the stone. The gap was critical. Hot air would rise through this gap, but the stone would absorb heat before it could reach the hay. The stone cylinder extended from the firebox up through the circular opening at the dome's apex, rising 2 feet above the highest point of the hay structure. Between the stone cylinder and the hay bales, Anders packed a thick layer of damp clay mixed with sand. This clay insulation filled the space between the chimney and the hay, creating a fireproof barrier. As the clay dried, it hardened into a ceramic-like material that would protect the hay from heat while allowing the chimney to function. He was careful to keep the clay several inches away from the hot inner pipe, preventing it from cracking from thermal stress. The chimney design created a natural draft system. Cold air entered through small gaps Anders left at the base of the stone cylinder. This air heated as it rose through the gap between the clay pipe and stone, creating an updraft that pulled smoke efficiently from the firebox. The heated air in the gap also contributed warmth to the structure without posing a fire risk. The system was self-regulating. The hotter the fire, the stronger the draft, and the more efficiently smoke was removed. At the top of the chimney, Anders built a stone cap that prevented rain and snow from falling directly down the pipe while allowing smoke to escape. The cap was a flat stone slab supported by smaller stones, creating a covered opening that protected the chimney interior while maintaining airflow. He sealed the joints where the chimney penetrated the dome's apex with extra clay, ensuring no moisture could enter the hay structure from above. The completed chimney was a masterwork of practical engineering, addressing fire safety, heat management, and ventilation simultaneously. With the dome structure complete and the chimney functional, Anders turned his attention to protecting and finishing the interior. The exposed hay bales that formed the inner wall surface were vulnerable to several problems. They would shed loose straw constantly, creating mess and potentially blocking airflow. They would absorb moisture from cooking and breathing, which could lead to rot. And most critically, they remained flammable if exposed to sparks from the fire. Anders needed to seal the interior surface completely. He prepared a plaster mixture using clay from the river deposits, sand for strength, and chopped straw for reinforcement. The ratio was 3 parts clay to 2 parts sand to 1 part chopped straw, mixed with water until it reached a thick, spreadable consistency. He had experimented with various mixtures during the summer and found this combination dried hard while remaining slightly flexible, preventing cracks as the hay settled. Anders applied the plaster directly to the hay bale walls, working from bottom to top. He spread it thick, creating a layer approximately 1 inch deep that filled the gaps between bales, covered all exposed straw. The plaster adhered well to the rough hay surface, gripping the straw fibers and creating a mechanical bond. He worked methodically, completing one section before moving to the next, ensuring even coverage with no thin spots that might crack. The plaster application took him 5 days of constant work. His hands became raw from the clay's alkaline properties, and his shoulders ached from the overhead work required to coat the curved ceiling. But the result was transformative. The rough hay interior disappeared beneath a smooth gray-brown surface that looked almost like stone. The plaster created a hard shell inside the dome that was fireproof, moisture-resistant, and structurally reinforcing. While the plaster was still slightly damp, Anders used a flat stone to polish the surface, compressing the outer layer and creating a smooth finish that would resist absorbing moisture. The polished plaster had an almost glazed appearance in some areas where he had worked it most thoroughly. The technique was similar to methods used in adobe construction, and it created a surface that was both beautiful and functional. He whitewashed the plastered walls using lime dissolved in water. The whitewash brightened the interior dramatically, reflecting the limited light from the doorway, and creating a sense of spaciousness despite the small interior diameter. The white surface would also make it easier to see inside during winter's limited daylight hours. He applied 2 coats, allowing each to dry before adding the next. The floor received similar treatment. Anders covered his stone floor with a layer of clay plaster, creating a smooth, sealed surface. Over this, he spread a thin layer of sand that could be swept clean easily. The floor was now waterproof, preventing moisture from rising from the ground, and smooth enough to walk on comfortably in bare feet or soft moccasins. He built minimal furniture, understanding that the space was limited. A sleeping platform raised 1 foot off the floor ran along one curved wall, constructed from wooden planks supported by stone pillars. Beneath the platform, he created storage space for food and supplies. Anders completed his hay dome in the first week of October 1867. The entire construction had taken 9 weeks from foundation to final whitewash, representing hundreds of hours of solitary labor. He stood outside the finished structure and examined what he had built. It was 12 feet tall, 18 feet in diameter at the base, and curved smoothly to a point marked by the stone chimney rising another 2 feet above the apex. The exterior hay bales were still visible, golden and rough, but Anders planned to coat them with clay plaster before winter to protect them from weather. He began moving his belongings from the cabin he could no longer bear to occupy. His possessions were few: clothing, cooking implements, tools, a few books, his carpentry equipment, and the sparse household goods that had survived Ingrid's death. Everything fit easily in the dome's interior, which felt surprisingly spacious, despite measuring only 10 feet in diameter inside the thick walls. The curved ceiling created a sense of openness that a flat ceiling would have lacked. The first test fire in his new home was a moment of genuine uncertainty. Anders had calculated and planned carefully, but theory and practice sometimes diverged. He built a small fire in the stone firebox using kindling and a few small logs. Smoke rose into the chimney and drew upward smoothly. No smoke leaked into the interior space. The clay pipe channeled everything safely outside. He added larger logs gradually, building the fire to a size that would provide real heat. The chimney draft strengthened as the fire grew, pulling smoke efficiently and warming the stones around the firebox. Within an hour, the interior temperature had risen noticeably. Anders monitored his thermometer carefully. Outside temperature was 45 degrees. Inside, the temperature climbed to 65 degrees with a moderate fire. He let the fire burn down to coals and waited to see how quickly the structure would lose heat. After 4 hours, the interior temperature had dropped only 3 degrees. The hay walls were holding warmth exactly as he had predicted. Word of the completed structure spread through the settlement quickly. The absurd hay house was finished, and Bergman had actually moved into it. Curiosity brought visitors despite the mockery. Thomas McCarran came with several other men to examine the dome. They walked around it slowly, touching the hay walls, peering through the doorway, shaking their heads at the strangeness of it all. The structure hadn't collapsed as they had predicted, which was surprising, but it still looked ridiculous. McCarran delivered his verdict with the confidence of a man who understood proper construction. The hay would rot by spring once moisture got into it. Mice would infest it within weeks and turn it into a rodent nest. The first strong wind would tear the unbonded bales apart. And most critically, the whole thing was a fire trap waiting for one stray spark. He gave it until December before Anders would be forced to abandon his foolish experiment and build a real cabin. The other men nodded in agreement. Anders thanked them for their visit and said nothing in his own defense. November brought early snow and temperatures that dropped steadily as the month progressed. Anders settled into his new home and established routines. He rose before dawn, built up his fire from the previous night's coals, and prepared a simple breakfast. The morning ritual was the same as it had been in his cabin, but the experience was fundamentally different. His cabin had required constant fire maintenance to stay warm. The dome retained heat so efficiently that he could let the fire burn low overnight and wake to interior temperatures that were still comfortable. He tracked temperatures obsessively, recording both interior and exterior readings 3 times daily. The data confirmed what he had hoped. On days when outside temperature was 20 degrees, interior temperature stayed around 55 degrees, with a small fire burning for only 4 hours. On colder days, when outside temperature dropped to 0, he needed to maintain the fire longer, but the interior still reached 60 degrees easily and held that temperature for hours after the fire died. The hay walls were performing even better than his calculations had suggested. The 2-foot thickness, combined with the trapped air in thousands of hollow straw stems, created an insulation barrier that had no equivalent in traditional construction. Log cabin walls were perhaps 8 inches thick of solid wood. Anders' walls were 2 feet thick of material that barely conducted heat at all. The difference was dramatic. In mid-November, a storm system moved through the region, bringing high winds that gusted past 40 miles per hour. Anders stayed inside his dome and listened to the wind howl. He expected to hear bales tearing loose or the structure groaning under stress. Instead, the wind passed over and around the curved surface, with barely any sound reaching the interior. The aerodynamic shape he had created was deflecting the wind rather than catching it. When the storm passed, Anders inspected the exterior. Not a single bale had shifted. The structure stood exactly as he had built it. The predictions about mice proved partially correct. Rodents did attempt to enter the hay walls, attracted by the warmth and potential nesting material. But Anders had anticipated this problem. The clay plaster on the interior created a hard barrier mice couldn't penetrate easily. The exterior hay bales were accessible, but mice that burrowed into them found no way through to the living space. He set simple wooden traps around the foundation perimeter and caught several mice in the first weeks, but the problem never became the infestation his critics had predicted. Rain and snow did wet the exterior bales, which concerned Anders more than the mice. He watched carefully for signs of rot or deterioration. The bales darkened where they got wet, and frost formed on them during cold nights, but they dried during sunny days and showed no structural damage. Still, he decided not to wait until spring to protect them. In late November, he began applying clay plaster to the exterior surface, working on mild days when the temperature allowed the clay to spread without freezing. The cold began on January 12, 1868, exactly 1 year after the night Anders lost his family. The temperature had been seasonally normal for early January, perhaps 15 degrees above zero during the day and dropping to zero at night. But on the 12th, a weather system moved down from Canada, bringing air so cold it felt solid. By evening, the temperature had fallen to negative 20 degrees. By midnight, it reached negative 35. By dawn on January 13th, it was negative 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Anders woke in his dome to interior temperature of 42 degrees. His fire had burned down to ash overnight, providing no heat for the past several hours, yet the thick hay walls had prevented the cold from penetrating. He rebuilt his fire and added enough wood to create substantial heat. Within 2 hours, the interior temperature climbed to 60 degrees. He sat drinking hot coffee and realized that he was comfortable, genuinely warm, while outside the settlement was experiencing cold that killed. Around mid-morning, he heard pounding on his outer door. He opened it to find William Harris, a neighbor who lived a quarter-mile away, standing in the airlock chamber with his wife and 3 children. Harris was shaking so violently he could barely speak. His cabin fire had gone out during the night, and they had been unable to get it relit. The cold had invaded their cabin so quickly that frost formed on the interior walls within minutes. They had huddled under blankets, but the children were crying from cold, and Harris feared they would freeze if they stayed. Anders brought them inside. The Harris family stood in the dome's warmth and slowly stopped shaking. The children moved close to the stone firebox, and color returned to their faces. Harris looked around the interior with an expression Anders couldn't quite read, shame perhaps, mixed with desperate gratitude. This was the structure he had called Bergman's haystack. This ridiculous dome had just saved his family's lives. Over the next 6 hours, more families arrived: the Anderson family with their infant son, the widow Peterson and her elderly father, the Schultz family with 4 children. Each arrival brought the same story. Their cabins were too cold. Their fires couldn't keep up with the brutal temperature. Children were in danger. Could they please shelter in the hay dome until the cold broke? Anders took them all in. 12 people eventually crowded into the space designed for one. They sat against the curved walls, wrapped in blankets they had brought. Anders kept the fire burning steadily, adding wood whenever it burned low. The stone firebox radiated heat that the hay walls trapped and held. The interior temperature stayed near 60 degrees despite the press of bodies and the frequent opening of doors as new arrivals came. Through his small window, Anders watched the settlement. Several cabins showed no smoke from their chimneys. Others had smoke pouring from chimneys as families desperately burned wood trying to stay warm. He saw Thomas McCarran struggling across the snow toward the dome, carrying his young daughter. The temperature began rising slowly on the afternoon of January 14th. By evening, it had climbed to -20 degrees, still brutally cold, but no longer the catastrophic extreme of the previous night. The families, sheltering in Anders's dome, remained through the night, sleeping in shifts against the curved walls, while Anders kept the fire maintained at a steady level. The children slept surprisingly well, warm enough that they didn't wake crying as they had in their own frozen cabins. By dawn on January 15th, the temperature had risen to -5 degrees. Families began venturing back to their own homes to assess damage and restart their fires. What they found was sobering. Every cabin in the settlement showed frost damage on interior walls. Many had split logs where moisture had frozen and expanded. Food supplies that families thought were safely stored indoors had frozen solid. Water buckets were solid ice. And in 3 cabins, the cold had claimed lives. Jacob Steinberg, age 67, had frozen to death in his bed despite blankets and a fire his son had kept burning all night. The Larsons' infant daughter had died in her mother's arms, too small to maintain body heat against the penetrating cold. And Sarah Mitchell, who had been ill with pneumonia, had succumbed during the coldest hours. 3 deaths in a settlement of 43 families was a devastating toll, but it could have been worse. Without Anders' dome, the Harris children would likely have died. The widow Peterson's elderly father would not have survived. The Anderson infant was showing signs of dangerous cold when they arrived at the dome. The families who had sheltered in the hay structure returned to their homes changed. They had spent hours in a space they had mocked, and that space had saved them. The cognitive dissonance was difficult to process. Thomas McCarran stood outside his own cabin, looking at the carefully built log walls that had nearly killed his daughter, then looked toward Anders's dome, visible in the distance. Something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of proper construction. Over the following days, visitors came to the dome not to mock, but to ask questions. How had Anders built it? What materials had he used? Why did it work so much better than log construction? Anders answered patiently, explaining the principles of trapped air and insulation. He showed them the thick hay walls, the clay plaster barriers, the design features that held warmth. Some visitors understood immediately. Others struggled with the concept that dead grass could outperform solid wood, but the evidence was undeniable. The settlement's minister held a service for the 3 who had died. During his sermon, he spoke about wisdom coming from unexpected sources and the dangers of dismissing new ideas simply because they challenged tradition. He didn't mention Anders by name, but everyone understood the reference. After the service, several men approached Anders and asked if he would help them build similar structures before next winter. Anders spent the spring and summer of 1868 helping other families build hay bale domes. He didn't charge for his assistance, viewing it as a duty to prevent more deaths like those he had witnessed. By autumn, 7 new hay structures stood in the settlement, each built using the principles Anders had developed. The designs varied based on available materials and individual family needs, but all shared the core features: thick hay bale walls, dome or arched construction, clay plaster protection, and careful chimney isolation. The winter of 1868 to 1869 brought several cold snaps. though none as severe as the negative 58-degree event of the previous year. The hay structures performed flawlessly. Families burning half the firewood they had previously consumed stayed warmer than they had ever been in log cabins. The structures proved durable through freeze-thaw cycles, windstorms, and heavy snow accumulation. Word spread to other settlements in the Dakota Territory. Travelers passing through Yankton Bend saw the unusual dome structures and asked about them. Anders' technique became known as the Bergman method, though he never promoted it himself. By 1870, hay bale construction had spread to settlements within a 100-mile radius. Some builders created rectangular structures instead of domes. Others used sod bricks mixed with hay. But the core principle of using thick agricultural materials for insulation had taken root. The original critics gradually acknowledged their error, though some did so more gracefully than others. Thomas McCarran eventually built a hay structure himself in 1869 and admitted publicly that he had been wrong to mock Anders. Others quietly adopted the technique without ever acknowledging their previous skepticism. Anders continued farming his claim and living in his hay dome. He never remarried, though several families attempted to introduce him to suitable women. He seemed content with his solitary life, finding satisfaction in his work and in knowing his innovation had saved lives. He kept detailed records of temperature measurements and structural observations, filling notebooks with data that satisfied his methodical nature. He died on March 23, 1891, at age 56 from pneumonia contracted during early spring field work. He was buried beside Ingrid and Karin on the hill above the settlement. His gravestone identified him simply as Anders Bergman, farmer, with no mention of the structures he had pioneered. His hay dome stood for another 40 years, occupied by various families who appreciated its warmth and durability. By the early 1900s, hay bale construction had evolved into more refined techniques. Modern straw bale construction, popular among sustainable builders today, traces its conceptual lineage back to a Norwegian farmer who refused to accept that tradition was the only answer. The settlement of Yankton Bend eventually disappeared, absorbed into larger towns as the frontier era ended. Anders Bergman's grave remains on the hill, notable only to historians who research frontier building techniques. The impossible had become routine. A house built from hay was a testament to the principle that survival on the frontier required questioning tradition and following evidence. Anders proved that innovation often came from ordinary people who paid attention and refused to accept that the old ways were the only ways. His legacy was warmth on cold nights for families who might otherwise have frozen, and knowledge that revolutionary ideas sometimes hide in plain sight.